Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
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 It's Friday, February 2nd. It is 9 a.m. We are going to start the day hearing two bill introductions from Representative Mulvaney Stanek. And then after the floor, which should be fairly brief, we are going to pick back up S18. We have a few requests out for testimony, but it was short notice, so we might only have one witness later this morning. And then if we do have further time, I encourage you to go off and think about the education fund. And I really hope, if I don't remember to say this later, that everyone takes this weekend to heal and drink tea. I feel like we have like a disease spreading around the table. And I just want everyone to like rest up, get your, eat some soup and come back Tuesday.
So I canceled the parents' night last night because everybody was so sick.
Yeah.
Take my children for the weekend.
Nope. With that, Representative Mulvaney Stanek would love to hear about H650 and H692 in whatever way you want to use the next 30 minutes of our time.
Amazing. Thank you very much. For your record, I'm State Representative Emma Mulvaney Stanek. I represent Chittenden 17, which is a portion of Burlington. And I have two bills for you. And after hearing that introduction, Madam Chair, I'm glad I'm not in the room to avoid illness. So I hope you all stay healthy. I think I'll start with H650. I have a constituent in the room, Jake Durrell, who will help me with the second bill. So we'll do the first one to get that out of the way, and then hopefully have a bit of a more conversation on the second one. So H650 is an act relating to excluding income from damages. I don't think I'm giving the official bill title, but damages, including income tax, I should say, for the damages related to employment-related lawsuits from the Vermont state income tax. And I worked on this particular bill with the Office of Racial Equity because the Office of Racial Equity has been doing a lot of amazing work looking at statutes and policy and really naming where there are inequalities within our laws and systems and policies. And this is a tax policy example where I think we could do a bit better. So probably all US states right now mirror federal tax policy, all of which you all are much more experts than I, mirror federal tax policy by taxing the settlements for lost wages in the cases of workplace discrimination. But we do not do this, no states do this in the case of workplace injury. And so workplace injury claims tend to be most often brought by white folks, white men in particular, and workplace discrimination claims tend to be brought more often by women, people of color, and people living with disabilities. And when the Office of Racial Equity was helping me with this bill, they touched base with the Vermont Department of Tax about what foregone revenue would happen if we were to enact such a change. And they said that it would be extremely small if there was any much of an impact at all in terms of if we were to exempt workplace discrimination settlements from the state income tax. So this would be an attempt, again, to create some equity between how we tax workplace injury claims as well as workplace discrimination claims. And just to talk a little bit more about this, about the why, and then I'm happy to take questions as this is a pretty short bill, is that we really want to think about maybe not by intention, but certainly by impact. Right now, the way it's structured is that a workplace injury could certainly be interpreted as more deserving because we exempt that from income tax right now, or it's more harmful to an individual. And I would argue that discrimination in the workplace based on gender, based on race, et cetera, is also harmful and should be given the same parity and equity as actual physical injury in the workplace. I think in general, this continues to move Vermont into making sure we have strong and safe and inclusive workplaces that really see things harm to workers in a similar light. And it also supports people who are doing the brave work and courageous work of naming harassment and discrimination in the workplace. And again, want to emphasize this particularly helps marginalized folks, women, people of color, and folks living with disabilities. And this would be just another thing that I think Vermont could be proud of in terms of really doing the work to make inclusive workplaces. I'll just say that I think I saw one other note from the Office of Racial Equity, and I would encourage you to bring them in if you decide to take up this bill. But the Department of Tax polled some other states. Actually, I already said this already. So Vermont could be a leader because they polled other states and no other state at this point does the exemption for workplace discrimination claims for state income tax. But I think this is a great place for Vermont to take the lead. And I'm happy to try to answer any questions if I can.
I think I'm trying to get my head around sort of what the bounds of this kind of lawsuit or damages might be in statute already. Just because it's an area that I don't know much about.
Right. So I would certainly look to Suzanne Davis, Executive Director of Office of Racial Equity, for a little bit more in terms of actual examples, or even probably Damian Leonard from Legislative Council to talk a little bit more about this. But essentially, it's employment-related lawsuits that relate to discrimination that I'm trying to narrowly focus in on, because that is taxed. If you have a settlement, if you're victorious and you have a settlement which is counted as income, that is taxed under the state income tax laws.
Thank you. Representative Anthony.
Thank you, and welcome, Representative Mulvaney-Stanning. I have one clarification question. Because there is dual jurisdiction, that is, we have our own state discrimination laws, but are you referring to settlements that arise under federal law or either? I haven't got the text in front of me, so I couldn't.
Sure. Well, don't worry. It's a very, very short bill without being a formal short bill. But it would be related to state discrimination claims. It's under state law, I should say.
Not the federal. All right.
Right. Well, we couldn't impact federal. That would be for a federal delegation to work on.
No, I don't mean federal taxes. I mean a federally a suit that finds its way in a U.S. district court as opposed to state court.
Right.
Because
And I
either
don't want to
one
get
could prosecute.
right. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'm just going to pause and say that's a great question for Damian Leonard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Representative Mulvaney-Stanning, is there a, I mean, I see that the text that you've added to the statute here, but is there something in current statute that exempts those other, the sort of
workplace injury?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe so. Again, I work with the Office of Racial Equity, and that I mean, I'm trusting their analysis of the current tax code, but right now, state income tax, if you have a workplace injury claim, that is exempt from state income tax under current tax code in Vermont.
Does that show up in a separate statute, or do you know where that is?
I keep saying I don't know, but I don't know.
All right, well, I can ask, I mean, I guess, did Damian draft this?
This was drafted, I'm going to have to just tell you again, I'm sorry. I apologize. I don't remember which ledge counsel drafted this for me. I'm pretty sure it was your tax attorney, not Damian, though.
Okay. All right.
Who I don't normally work with, which is why I probably cannot pull their name out of my head right now. Apologies.
All right. Thanks. I just love to see the language that exempts. I mean, I'm assuming there's language.
It was Kirby. Yeah.
It was Kirby. I'm assuming there's language that exempts those other types of, I'd just like to see that too.
Absolutely. Yep.
So it sounds like if we want to dive deeper on this, then we should have Susanna Davis in, and we should have Kirby in, and they can sort of talk us through some of the surrounding pieces of this bill, which I am curious about myself. Any other questions for Emma on this one? Okay. Back to you for the next stop.
Thank you so much. So the next bill I wanted to walk you both all through is H692. It's an act relating to encouraging the sale of homes to buyers who are financing. And my amazing constituent, who is not going to be my constituent for much longer because he's in the process of purchasing a home himself, Jake Durrell, is in the room. So I'm going to cue this up and then pass it over to him, if I may, to tell you a little bit more about why. But in a very, very small nutshell or brief introduction here, we all know that we're living in Vermont through a housing emergency and have for several years now. And folks who are low and moderate income often have to use financing, mortgages, other ways of purchasing homes, because that's the only way one can get into home ownership for the most part if you're a working person. And so what that means, though, in terms of in a housing market where a lot of people are interested in home purchasing in Vermont, is that we have other buyers out there who can pay in cash and don't need to do that kind of level of financing. And sellers are often trying to usually go through a faster process, perhaps, and pass over those who need financing through mortgages, because there's usually timelines and banks and other processes that create a longer timeline, perhaps for folks who are, again, low to moderately income, needing to use financing. So this creates a barrier for folks who are working folks who need to use a different method of purchasing homes when our market is so competitive. This bill proposes just one suggestion. There can be lots of different ways to do this, but we wanted to put forward an idea that we should be doing what we can to help people find pathways to home ownership who are low and moderately income. And this includes thinking about some sort of incentive, some sort of tax-related policy to help incentivize sellers of houses. And this would be for primary residences only, emphasis on primary residence, to encourage those sellers to work with a buyer who has to use financing. The idea in here was just one idea I was working with the Ledge Council about. So this is not, again, meant to be an exhaustive list, but the idea here was to create a surcharge on the sellers, and it would be waived if they choose to work with a buyer who is using financing, again, to incentivize those kinds of transactions and relationships. This way, it would also keep the revenue neutral for the state in terms of any other kind of tax mechanism that might have a modest impact on revenue for the state. And last thing I'll just say on this before I hand it over to Jake is, again, I see this as another, this is real economic equity bill, but it's also one I think related to racial equity, because I'm sure we've all sat through briefings where we know there's a very low home ownership rate for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Vermont, BIPOC folks, largely because they have had lack of access to generational wealth over the decades. And this would be one more idea, one more piece of policy we could put forward that would benefit those folks who have to use financing, because again, in this case of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, structural racism has really prevented folks from BIPOC folks from building generational wealth that might have positioned them to be able to move into home ownership with either minimal or no financing on their end. So with that, I'd love to pass this over to Jake, because this is his idea. I love when constituents offer great ideas. I think that makes us better legislators, and I appreciated him flagging this for me off session. So I'm gonna pass it to Jake. Hi, Jake.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, so I'm thank you.
If you could start by introducing yourself formally for the record, and then
Yeah.
sharing your thoughts, that would be great.
So my name's Jacob Durrell. I'm a state employee. I'm also kind of an attorney on the side, and I formerly, as of a couple of days ago, a resident of Burlington, like now an Airbnb resident, waiting for my next house to close. But I'm not a real estate or housing expert. I had brief stints working at Harlem Legal Aid and Housing and at Burlington Housing Authority, and then for a Vermont nonprofit that was trying a sort of trust concept that didn't end up working. So those were all kind of brief things, but they have me thinking about housing a lot. So in my own experience with my wife and I trying to move out of Burlington first in like 2021, and putting bids in and having them shut down at every turn, and we're putting even taken for lower cash bids, and I understand that there are legitimate reasons that people need to sell quickly sometimes, but it didn't seem as much as as routinely as it was happening in our experience, and what the anecdotes I hear all over the place about this. It didn't seem that like there's that many emergencies where people have to sell that quickly, and it seemed to me that there's more kind of an economic failure where the decision making is not really is skewed in some way, and there's some bias created against lender finance transactions. I was thinking that if there could be something to do to correct the psychology around those transactions, that would be great. I think I first prodded Emma about that maybe a little under a year ago. And then I think when I really started banging on her door was when my neighbor had to move out because her landlord was selling, and then she lost to a cash transaction. And this is like a duplex. So my property that I lived in kind of just, became an investment property. And we, and then like before, the buyer even introduced themselves, they're trying to, make offers on our property. And we're like, no, we're not. Like, we kind of had wanted to leave Burlington, but we didn't, not in that circumstance. And so, yeah, so then I started coming up with ideas with Emma. One thing I had scribbled down was like a property transfer tax. That if it was a cash finance transaction, barring certain exceptions, like maybe a $12,000 hit or something, maybe that's drastic. But I think that there's, we certainly people pull out of their retirement. We want to encourage retirement, right? People pull out of their retirement quickly because of the effects of that. We penalize it. So same thing with housing, and it has an effect on the community. So, if we look at, I think particularly in Chittenden and Lamoille County, like the risk board of what's happening of, with ownership, I think having such a, smaller and smaller percentage of people, owner occupied, it results in less people dedicated, working for the community. I think that if you have a community of people that have never had to take a loan, I think that's a risk to the long-term value of the community. So, so I'm very appreciative of Emma just bringing the idea to the table. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. When I've heard, certainly this is something that happens in my community too. And I think I have always assumed that those sort of like cash transactions that were prioritized were also like much higher offers. But I realized, as you're speaking, I realized that I actually have no idea and I've never asked. And then it might just be the prioritizing of cash over the complication of financing. So I really appreciate you bringing this to us. Thank you.
And I only have my anecdotes, and it's just.
That's how most legislation's made. So no.
But I think it's worth, researching at least like as a minimum, start for the session or what, yeah.
Thanks. I think it is something we'll look into. Representative Anthony and then Representative Brannigan.
Madam Chair, and welcome, sir. I have long tried to explore mechanisms, whether it's the long-term cost of being a permanent resident, property taxes and so on, or the short-term issue of who's going to participate in the transaction. I have long felt that it is a detriment to particularly small communities that depend on a permanent population base to run the town.
Right.
All other issues notwithstanding, I mean, self-government depends on people to volunteer for the fire department, the town clerk, the board of civil authority. So whether it's at the front end, the transaction end, to hedge the incentive or the bets for permanent residents, I'm in. I would like to see, somebody else talk about the various mechanisms that we could employ. This is just at the front end. But for me, it's a long-term issue of more and more permanent housing become either speculative or seasonal, and consequently creating part of the housing crisis that we're all talking about all the time.
I remember talking to one of our attorneys a couple of years ago about just even trying to define what sort of speculative owned housing was and really not being able to find our way through that. But I think it's worth digging into. I'm sorry, you were going to respond to Representative Anthony.
Oh, yeah. So, I did try and talk to some folks before coming in, and like a real estate agent friend of ours. And and she did emphasize that there are emergency situations where people need to sell. And, she had offered like some of the things that she saw was like the appraisal process. If sellers did appraisals up front, then it would just make the risk around the lender transactions, it would reduce it a bit because there would be that knowledge of the property, and it would just be a quicker transaction. So if there was a tax incentive for a seller that had done that, maybe as part of their offering, could be one approach. there was, and also she had mentioned that if there was, to create more, assurance around, like, more than a pre-approval letter, maybe a pre-approval letter doesn't create enough certainty for sellers, or, so if there were just more, mechanisms, and maybe there's ways banks could be incentivized to do that, to show that this person's, really vetted, they've held their job for X years, and it's, and if there's, an objective, non-discriminatory way to accomplish that, that would be maybe another avenue. But
Representative Brannigan?
I've also tried to find some way that this would work. I know that this sometimes occurs among families, where one person will sell a property to another and receive payment for it over long term, and it's all off the books. It's all off the books in the sense that there's no bank involved. So, but do you know if, I'm asking because I really don't know the answer to this, but do you know if there's, for the one who holds the pink slip, is there any tax deduction already in line, either at the state or federal level, for the person who's holding that, which is then an amount due to them?
who holds the note, like,
Yeah.
like the bank, like the, or in,
In this case, it's not the bank.
right, a family transaction. If,
Right.
If yeah, I don't know of it. I know they're taxed on the interest that they earn, if any.
On the interest.
Yeah, they can
The example
gift a certain amount of
is,
interest.
There's no interest. It's just the selling, just the rate.
Well, they can avoid the gift tax on the interest, if, I think, among family, you can gift a certain amount, so I think if it's in the form of interest, they're not gonna pay tax on that interest, so there's that incentive
Yeah, okay.
there, I think.
And what you have in mind, backing up a bit for this bill, I haven't read it yet. What you have in mind is some kind of a surcharge that would be forgiven in these transactions. Is that right? So
Yeah.
everybody else would get the surcharge. And then these folks would get it reduced or forgiven, whether it's on property transfer tax or an initial price on the property, or is any, something, but it would go away.
Right, there's not a lot of taxes on the seller now, so I don't know if there's there's land gains tax and income tax, but there's maybe within just like the land gain tax forms that are exchanged, you could attach something to that. Even if there's no gain, that you're still, providing this surcharge, but unless they meet, one of, probably a good number of listed
Interesting.
exemptions, but, yeah, and I think, I would just want to say that I really think, housing trusts are something that we should be like pursuing and promoting more. So if there was funding created for that, and that could be, diverted to that purpose. I tried to sell my, when we moved out of Burlington, because our home had already been bought by a cash buyer that was kind of, operating it, in a way I don't think would be good for somebody buying into it. And because we were being so rushed on our next property we were buying, I first tried to sell to Champlain Housing Trust because I thought they could deal with that other owner, but they said they don't have enough, money for that kind of thing right now. And so, yeah, we sold to that person because that was the path of least resistance for us. So I did that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Take care. So we
Thank
are.
you, committee. Thank you, committee.
Thank you
I
so much for
appreciate it. And
joining
thank you
us.
for allowing Jake to also join me. I really appreciated that. And thank you,
It's
Jake. Good job.
absolutely our pleasure. So committee, we are back here after the floor.